We're going to have a look at net zero today from two perspectives. The first is the mass media perspective, where we're going to get two people shouting at each other, throwing sound bites at each other, as often we do see in the media. And this is what I would say 80%, 90% of the population even looks at, with which to draw their conclusions and decisions. Then we're going to have a look at a slightly more sensible and move into the intellectual stance of the debate. And we're going to listen to a gentleman called Paul Marshall, who made a recent speech at an ARC conference in London. And this is part of, the intelligentsia's debate relating to net zero and how those arguments are positioned. But I think both of these clips show conclusively the ideological nature and essentially how silly it is that Western countries and democracies are going after this net zero policy for a teeny tiny change in our climate. And so here's the first clip here. We've got Constantine Kissin, who I do like. I watch his podcast, quite regularly. And we've got this climate activist here who keeps dipping in and out of climate and keeps going into cultural Marxism. You'll be able to see it. And of course, as ever, what you do see is, you see within a few seconds of a debate, and when people do get challenged, the old socialist bug eyes come out. And this is characteristic of all socialists. You start arguing with them and eventually they get annoyed. They start thrusting their chin forward, waggling their head like bobblehead. And then, of course, you get bug eyes, and that's how you know that they're a socialist. So here's the first clip, and we'll have a chat after.
If you could tell the people of Britain, what percentage of global climate emissions is Britain responsible for?
Okay, so every country is
No, just answer, what percentage? It's a figure.
Every country
I'll tell you,
is responsible for about 1%,
It's
apart
2%.
from China and India, which we do our dirty work. Grow up.
I'm trying. If we do what you want, which is spend £1.5 trillion, which is about 8 years' worth of the NHS budget,
Want to stop funding fossil fuel
net
companies.
zero. If we do that, by what percentage will we reduce global temperatures about which you're so concerned?
Look, your argument is silly.
Could you answer the question? What impact will we make?
Leading is not telling people what they want to hear. Leading is doing the right thing regardless of what anybody else are doing. And China actually are way ahead of us.
If we reduce...
I would say that is the first thing you've said today. I agree with.
So if we do that...
If you gave me a bit longer, I think
what result will we achieve?
It's a really uncomfortable
You've got to tell the
situation
people of Britain, if you want to spend 1.5
trillion... And you brought this man in just to argue with me.
If you were to spend 1.5 trillion pounds of British taxpayers' money, what result would you achieve? I think people would like to know that.
What we need is deliberative democracy. We need participatory budgeting. We need people...
So you don't know? You don't know what impact on global temperatures will have?
And we all need to take responsibility.
Now, if I was going to go on television to defend a position, I might know some of the numbers. This lady has spent so long mouthing off to her ideological compadres, or should I say comrades, that she's forgotten one of the basic points here. If you've got an argument and it's going to cost £1.5 trillion over the next 10 years or whatever it is, then we're going to have to know precisely what it is that you're after. I don't think that's too far of a stretch to go. It's quite a lot of money. It's 10 years worth of NHS money. I mean, think what the country could do with that money. Now, looking at this lady here, the slightest bit of pressure there. She's sitting there waiting for the question. Question gets delivered, and boom. What does she resort to? Well, she resorts to ad hominem attacks. Why don't you grow up? Well, he was just asking you a question there. He wasn't being particularly nasty. He wasn't going overboard. He was just asking you to confirm. If we're going to be spending £1.5 trillion over the next X years, how much can we expect to get from that? I think that's a reasonable question. Let's say I'm going to purchase something. So I'm going to purchase a mobile phone worth a few £100s. I'm going to want to know what I'm getting for my money. So I might say to the mobile phone company, so what am I getting for this new Samsung phone? And they're going to say, oh, you know what it is? I'm going to justify that by telling you this. And they're really specific about it. But with this type of argument, £1.5 trillion, immediately there is no argument. This lady's attempting here to say that we need to be leading the debate. We need to be the ones that are pushing this agenda forward because Britain needs to be at the forefront of what we're doing. To which the question I have is, why? Why should Britain be at the forefront of it? Why don't we just simply be an average of what's going on? We've already reduced our emissions since this whole silliness started by between 40 and 50%. I think we're doing okay. I think we're on the way to doing it. And of course, these climate people go on as if they're the moral centre of the argument. These people aren't the moral centre. Most of these people live in inner cities. Most of these people come from middle-class households, and they know nothing about the environment in its reality. To me, the environment represents those green spaces that we can go to where you can breathe good fresh air, where the water comes down from the top of the mountain and it's nice and clear. Everybody wants nice air. Everybody wants clean water. Everybody wants the environment to be beautiful and birds in the trees and, plants everywhere. Everybody loves that. These people assume the moral and ethical centre of the debate, and they have no right to be there. And this lady especially has no right to be there because she doesn't know her brief. She shouldn't have volunteered to come on television because she doesn't know anything about the climate or what we're expected to get when we spend £1.5 trillion on this climate change lunacy. She doesn't even know what we're going to get. But as you see, what she starts to do there, she starts to drift into cultural Marxism, which we see time and time again. This lady is a climate person. So what does she start saying? Apart from the, why don't you grow up and everybody needs to take responsibility. Yeah, perhaps you should take some responsibility too. But in the middle of that, you may have missed it, you may have caught it, but then she says, but all of these fossil fuel companies are making money. Well, I've got news for this lady. If the fossil fuel companies weren't making huge profits, you know where they'd be? In another part of the world. And another company would be charging us through the nose for the privilege of it. This is how the world works. The world doesn't work on unicorns and rainbows and, fluffy pillows and all the rest of it. The world works on something called money. And there's a thing that powers the whole global economy, and it's something called diesel. So without diesel, the world will stop. You will walk into the supermarket and you'll be looking on the shelves and you'll have to say, where's all the food gone from this supermarket? And then you'd say, hang on, everyone's not going to make any money because no one can get to work because there's no petrol, and there'd be nothing else. There'd be no household goods, there would be no food, and there would be complete anarchy in society without something called diesel. Okay, so let's move on to a really sensible, I would say, positioning of this argument and the reasons why we are doing this. So here he is, and this is Paul Marshall.
What I'm going to talk about now is something where there is actually a emergent split between continents and between our nations, and that is the problem of net zero. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the capital of net zero. Britain is very big on windmills. We are, in Boris Johnson's words, the Saudi Arabia of wind. In some ways, this is something to be proud of. Since 1990, the UK has cut its carbon emissions by over 50%. On this, we lead the G20. But in our quest for renewable energy, we lost something. We lost sight of the trade-offs involved in energy policy. We may be leading the G20 in emissions reductions, but we are also leading the way in sacrificing our energy security. We are leading the way in destroying our ancient rural landscapes. We are leading the way in wrecking our industrial base, and we are leading the way in impoverishing our people. This is not a party political point. Net zero is indeed being pushed to its extreme limits by an ideological Labour government, but it was passed into law by a Conservative government. Nor is this a speech about climate change. You don't need to be a climate change denier to be very fearful about where British energy policy is leading. And finally, this is not just a speech about Britain. What I'm describing is a European problem, and a Canadian problem, and an Australian problem. These countries have been infected by an ideological zeal which is leading us to sacrifice our economic prosperity and our people's livelihoods, all for the sake of making some fractional changes in the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Late-stage capitalism is prone to fall for luxury beliefs. We take for granted our prosperity. We take for granted the foundations of liberal democracy and free markets which underpin that prosperity, and we fall for fashions that we can't afford. And so these countries, which I fear are in a very late stage of capitalism, have contracted a severe case of climate derangement syndrome.
And some people, when they speak, have the ability to completely nail a topic. I mean, he'd obviously pre-done that little speech there, but he covered all the bases beautifully. And one of the things about a late-stage capitalism is that we've had the benefit of a lot of other times to view this. As a great example, there is ancient Rome, who debased their own currency by putting different metals in their coins, and they kind of revered the same types of people that we're revering now. So what you've got is an elevation in society of things like having famous chefs, famous sports people. You just have to look at the gladiators, you know, the overt sexualization of society and all of these things. It is a very, very, very interesting topic to look at if you are interested in that thing. And all of these features tend to happen in late stage capitalism before it blows up and we move on to the next thing. But one of the things is a luxury belief class. The people in a society get so comfortable with how they are that they start to imagine themselves as gods. And what they do when people start to imagine themselves as gods, then they actually abandon God. So God goes out the window. And then what happens? Well, those people become so high and mighty that they can't really be bothered to do the jobs that everyone was happy to do before. So what do? Well, they bring in people from all over the world to do those jobs because we're too good to be picking fruit in the fields or, you know, cleaning toilets in nightclubs. We're far too good for that. And so we need to bring people in to perform those roles in society. And then what happens? The demographics change. And then all of a sudden, the old society is swept away. Sometimes they're slaughtered. Who knows what happens after that? And then the new empire comes out of the ashes. But one of the things that categorizes all of that is a luxury belief class at the end of late stage capitalism. And in that luxury belief class, people believe because they're gods and because they believe they have a higher level of ethics than everybody else, they're the ones that believe they have the solution. And they get to make claims on society and push things onto society that the rest of the people below them can't afford and don't want to do. And this is just another example of our failing empire and why Western democracies and civilizations are declining at a rapid rate. It's not going to happen in its totality within any of our lifetimes, but the signs are all there. And once it starts to crumble, and once large chunks of it start dropping off, and the facade gets revealed for what it is, then, folks, then we're going to be in a little bit of trouble. Thanks very much for your time. I always appreciate it.